Good afternoon. Welcome to our lecture program. I am Kostas Zanos, Vice President and Chair of the Program Committee of Hellenic Link Midwest. First, I would like to announce our next lecture. It will take place on Sunday, December 1st at 3 p.m. Chicago time at the lecture hall of the St. Haralabos Church in Niles, Illinois. We will present Professor Nick Doumanis, Chair of Hellenic Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He will talk on the Greek millet and the late Ottoman Empire, 1821 to 1912. The lecture will focus on the state of the Ottoman Empire from the Greek Revolution of 1821 to the Balkan Wars, on the Tanzimat reforms, the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, and on how the Greeks living in the empire adjusted to these changes. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou. Dr. Prodromou is visiting professor in the International Studies program at Boston College and an affiliated faculty member of the Islamic Civilization and Societies program, as well as of the Boise Center in Religion and American Public Life. Her research interests and policy work focus on the intersection of geopolitics, religion, and human rights, with particular focus on the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. She has served a diplomatic appointment on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and she was a member of the United States Secretary of State's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group from 2011 to 2015. She is co-editor of 2 volumes, Eastern Orthodox Christianity and American Higher Education, and Thinking Through Faith. She has written multiple book chapters and is widely published in many academic journals. She co-chairs the Orthodoxy, Politics, and International Religions group of the International Orthodox Theological Association. Her policy and practitioner appointments include the Atlantic Council's Eurasian Center, Religions for Peace, and the Freedom of Religion on Belief Women's Alliance. She was a member of the delegation of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to the Holy and Great Council at Crete, Greece in 2016. Her current research focus is religious geopolitics and typologies of power, and on the effects of cultural heritage policy on institutional religions, freedom, and religious pluralism. Dr. Prodromou has taught at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where she was the founding faculty director of the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy at Boston University, Princeton University, and as an invited flying faculty member at the College of Europe. She earned a PhD and the Science of Master degree in Political Science from MIT, a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and a BA in History and International Relations from Tufts University. At the end of the delivery of the lecture, we are going to have a questions and answer session. You can write your questions during and after the delivery of the lecture on the Q&A screen, which will open by clicking the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Prodromou, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Costa, for that gracious introduction. And I want to begin by thanking the Hellenic Link Midwest for the opportunity to be with you today. again, offering special thanks to Dr. Konstantin Zanos and Dr. Stefanos Sakilaridis for managing all aspects of this webinar. And thank you as well for your gracious adaptation of what was meant to be an in-person talk to this webinar format. I'm sorry that my health issues, specifically ear and sinus problems, prevented me from flying to Chicago. But it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'd like to go directly to the topic at hand for today. I'm going to divide my remarks into 4 parts, and time constraints are going to force me to synthesize and compress a lot of very complex material, but I hope we can unpack things in our question and answer and discussion period. Let me start part 1. I want to share a bit of professional and personal information that helps to explain why and how I've come to work on cultural heritage as part of my broader work on human rights and religious freedom, and especially when it comes to the significance of cultural heritage policy for Turkey and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Then I'm going to turn in part 2 to an abbreviated review of the evolution of the definitions of cultural heritage and the linkages to human rights in international law. Part 3, I will outline the main features of the Turkish state's cultural heritage policy by offering a brief synopsis of the historical origins and the successive adaptations and augmentations in that policy, with specific focus on the application of Turkish cultural heritage policy to the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community of Turkey. And I should say that throughout the lecture, when I reference the Ecumenical Patriarchate, I mean more broadly the institution of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the entire Greek Orthodox community of Turkey. And I'm also going to say just a brief, make a brief mention of how the Turkish state has exported that domestic cultural heritage policy to spaces in which directly or indirectly Turkey exercises influence, in particular when it comes to Turkish-occupied Cyprus. And then in the 4th part, by way of conclusion, I want to offer some very brief suggestions on some possible policy responses or remedies to what until now has been the weaponization of cultural heritage policy by the Turkish state vis-a-vis the Greek Orthodox community and the Ecumenical Patriarchate, also to Turkish-occupied Cyprus, but in other parts of the world, and hopefully offer some constructive suggestions for some remedies. So let me begin now with a few words about why I've turned to focus on cultural heritage and human rights. As I wrote in the abstract that you shared, I think the current moment in international relations and the Eastern Mediterranean region provides an inflection point for thinking about the significance of cultural heritage policy and human rights policy. And that certainly has motivated my interest in these issues. December of last year, 2023, marked the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As we know, this was a landmark in setting out the parameters for the international community's recognition of a whole range of fundamental human rights that are meant to be universally protected, and therefore to support world peace, a rules-based international order, and to avoid the kind of bloodletting that had characterized the first half of the 20th century, including that century's first genocide, which was perpetrated by the Ottoman Turks against its Christian populations, and that continued with Nazi Germany's Holocaust against Jews and other vulnerable populations, but that also, unfortunately, continued throughout the 20th century. But the UDHR, its 75th anniversary, offered a moment for us to think about whether or not a rules-based international order that respects universal human rights, including the protection of cultural heritage, has been successful. 2023 was also an important inflection point when it comes to Turkey. Specifically, it marked the 100th anniversary, the 100-year anniversary, or the centennial of the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And then I've also been thinking about other inflection points in the last year or two. In particular, this past summer, July and August 2024, marked half a century of Turkey's invasion and ongoing occupation of Cyprus. And if we put these landmark moments into a broader context, and we think about what's been happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Israel and the Palestinian territories, what's been happening in China, and in so many other places around the world, we see that the international legal regime that's meant to uphold the lofty goals of the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that preamble states, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, we see that the international legal regime is under extreme duress. And I think it's prompted a combination of despair and cynicism that enables the worst kinds of state violators to act with impunity. So in thinking about these inflection points, I have, and also by virtue of the work that I did while a U.S. diplomat serving on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, I think that we see that it's important to consider the linkages between the protection of cultural heritage on the one hand and the protection of a broad basket of human rights on the other hand. So this is how I've come to today's talk. And also recognizing that cultural heritage policy oftentimes is paid short shrift. It gets little attention, or not the kind of attention it deserves for those who are preoccupied with universal human rights protections and a rules-based international order. Now, having said that, pondering these inflection points, let me turn to the second part of my talk and say a little bit about the linkages between cultural heritage law on the one hand and universal human rights, or human rights law, on the other. What we know is that the scope of international legal frameworks has evolved quite steadily over the past 75 years when it comes to definitions of cultural heritage and the links between heritage protection and human rights protections. And I would say that the quite dramatic changes in those international legal frameworks are complex. And so a deep dive into that evolution is beyond the scope of this talk. But let me say a few basic things. And by way of definitions, I would say most helpful is the explanation by Peter Kane and Joan Conahan in the New Oxford Companion of Law, where they define cultural heritage as evidence of the human remains of the past, which is regarded as worthy of preservation. I would also call us to Eric Dalal Mate's definition in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which emphasizes that cultural heritage is about the past, but is also just as much about the present and the future, about how culture is embroiled in contemporary moral controversies, and about what our cultural legacy will be. Now, both of these definitions draw on and are reflected in a whole host of international legal instruments that had their origins as far back as the 1899 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property and the Event of Armed Conflict, that run through the 1970 UNESCO Convention, and also on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, that run through the Convention concerning the protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage, WHC, and a whole host of UNESCO instruments beginning in this 21st century that call for the safeguarding of the diversity of cultural expressions, the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage, and more. Now, what are the key definitional, conceptual, and operational features in the broadening and deepening of international legal frameworks, tools, and mechanisms that deal with cultural heritage? First, we see that there is a shift beyond property, cultural property, to the notion of heritage, cultural heritage, which leads to the protection of both tangible and intangible forms of heritage, and also leads to a recognition of the intrinsic organic connections between tangible and intangible forms of heritage. And this shift positions human beings at the center, people at the center of the heritage conversation that initially focused only on material expressions of property. So here we see a definitional and a legal move that has been consequential for the linkages between cultural heritage protections and eventually universal human rights protections. And let me be even more specific. We can think of tangible cultural heritage as including, according to the Hague and UNESCO conventions, as, quote, movable and immovable property, such as monuments of architecture, art, or history, archaeological sites, groups of buildings, works of art, manuscripts, books, and other objects of artistic, historical, or archaeological interest. So in terms of thinking about the ecumenical patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community in Turkey, then we can think about churches, monasteries, convents, cultural centers, archives, libraries, and sites, including works of art such as icons and other types of art. Now, in terms of intangible cultural heritage, outlined, for example, in the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, here we can think of, quote, the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their heritage, transmitted from generation to generation, and providing them, therefore, with a sense of identity and continuity, unquote. So these definitions emphasize the chronicity of cultural heritage, the ethical dimensions of cultural heritage, that is, the intrinsic value of both tangible and intangible heritage to the people who create and live them. And that's where we get this notion of intangible heritage as living heritage. And finally, the positioning again of human beings, individuals and groups, or individuals and communities, as agentive in remembering, transmitting, practicing, and sustaining themselves via their cultural heritage. The other feature of the evolution of cultural heritage law that we see over time is that international instruments have moved from a focus on conditions of war and violence to conditions of nonviolence, or at least to conditions absent active or visible violence. And I think this is very important in terms of how it is that we understand threats to and also possibilities to preserve cultural heritage and the linkages to universal human rights protections. And because time is very tight, I'm going to sum up by noting here that the multiple generations of human rights protections from political rights have focused from going from a focus on political rights to include economic, social, and eventually environmental and cultural rights. And so that human rights law has now evolved into a network of legal instruments that recognize the protections of cultural heritage in terms of universal human rights protections. And here's a key point, that obligates states as signatories to those instruments as having primary responsibility to safeguard cultural heritage in both tangible and intangible forms in ways that allow, as Marc-André Renaud and Alessandro Cecchi summarize, individuals and communities to express their humanity and the meaning they give to their existence and build their worldview representing their encounter with the external forces affecting their lives. And perhaps most important of all, and here we can transition to the case study of Turkey's official cultural heritage policy and the way it has been deployed, and I would argue weaponized vis-a-vis the ecumenical patriarchate, and also exported. The full panoply of international human rights treaties and conventions that protect human rights, and this includes freedom of religion or belief, FORB, as is the acronym in outside of the US, or IRF, International Religious Freedom, the acronym used in the US, that enshrined in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These human rights protections and their links to cultural heritage are absolutely clear, categorically clear, that human rights and cultural rights protections cannot be at odds with one another. So they are understood as two sides of the same coin. Now here, let me turn then to part 3 of my talk and how we can apply this paradigm for cultural heritage and human rights to the case of Turkey. And again, I'm going to be necessarily brief and synoptic because of time limitations, but I'll be happy to unpack any of this or to elaborate on any of these points. I begin by saying that I think it's reasonable to claim that until the mediatized, internationally mediatized reversion of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, I use that ecclesiastical terms, but in Istanbul, to a functioning mosque in July 2020, most of the interest in Turkey's cultural heritage policy was limited to the domain of academics, scholars, that is, and art and architectural experts, with relatively limited appreciation for the origins and impacts of Ankara's cultural heritage policy as a weapon that has been deployed, or what I've called in some of my work as a cudgel that's been used against Turkey's ethnic and religious minority communities. Certainly with the ecumenical patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community of Turkey as illustrative of a broader pattern that has affected not just the Greek Orthodox community, but Turkey's other religious and ethnic minority communities, such as Armenians, Syriacs, Kurds, Jews, Alawites, and others. After the reversion of the Hagia Sophia to a functioning mosque in July 2020, because it was such a widely mediatized event, there has been a growing interest in the way in which, in the contours and the deployment of Turkey's cultural heritage policy vis-a-vis its religious and ethnic minorities. Now, let me say a few things about that policy. First of all, I think it's important for us to recognize that history matters, and understanding nationalism and its continuities in Turkey matter. And what do I mean here? Well, the Turkish state's cultural heritage policy is rooted in the founding conditions of the Republic in 1923. And that's what makes this centennial in 2023 so interesting. There have been clear elements of continuity from the formative Kemalist model of nationalism up through the current Erdoganist model of nationalism. And while conventionally understood as opposing forms of nationalism, insofar as one has been defined as secular and the other has been defined as religious, in fact, there's a growing revisionist literature that has revealed, I think, the fallacy, the mistake in this oppositional understanding of Kemalism and Erdoganism. And cultural heritage policy helps to reveal the continuities between these two expressions of nationalism in Turkey, because Kemalist laiklik and Erdoganist Islamism have actually been intrinsically connected by a commitment to the state's hegemonic management of religion for the purposes of building an ethno-religiously exclusivist form of nationalism, whose assumptions and practices operate according to a non-democratic logic. Let me say a bit more here. Mustafa Kemal and his state makers mobilized at the founding moment of the Republic and subsequently a cross-disciplinary cadre of state-supported professional intellectuals who were dedicated to creating a new national identity project expressed in the Turkish historical thesis and developed in the Turkish Review of Anthropology. This was an academic journal published from 1925 to 1939 by the University of Istanbul's Faculty of Medicine and the Anthropology Institute of Turkey. The raison d'etre of the institute was to contribute to the development of Kemal's Turkish historical thesis, and it combined eugenics with history to posit the superiority of, quote, the Turkish race, unquote, as masters of the country. And to explain that, and this again is a quote, the Greeks, the Jews, and the Armenians, while living here for a long time, were the descendants of a mongrel race. These are quotes, whose inferiority could be scientifically proven, ergo eugenics, according to Turkey's Minister of Justice from 1924 and 1930, Mahmut Esat Bozkurt. This is a quote from him. He opined that these groups were not genuine Turks and therefore could have only one right in the Turkish fatherland, that is, to be a servant, to be a slave. Now, this nationalism project, with its ethnic and religious dimensions, led to the organization of and the development of a cultural heritage policy under the institutional umbrella of the Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, and the Vakiflar, the Directorate General of Foundations, as well as the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Tourism, whereby cultural heritage policy was a crucial element of Turkey's nationalism project. And this is a project that has been neatly summarized by Turkish cultural heritage expert Sidam Atakum, who observed that, quote, national identities have been continuously reconfigured within heritage discourses. So here we see history and nationalism as important to understanding the institutions that were given the mandate to develop a cultural heritage policy, part of this early nationalist project, as I summed it up or described it. And indeed, there have been additional important inflection points in the evolution of this nationalist project with implications for cultural heritage policy. And one of the most important inflection points in the evolution of this policy came under the government of the late Prime Minister Turgut Özal. His government's Turkish Islamic synthesis configured nationalism in the direction of an openly religious, specifically Islamic model of national belonging, rendering more explicit what had been implicit in the Kemalist model, and also significantly expanding the purview of the Diyanet as the main manager of cultural heritage policy. We saw an earlier inflection point as well, and here I referenced earlier the export of cultural heritage policy as part of the nationalism project in 1974 with Turkey's invasion and occupation of Cyprus. But I come back to the domestic side of things during the period of the Özal government. Now, the increasing centralization of cultural heritage policy under the purview of the Diyanet, in some ways at the expense of the Vakiflar and the tourism and cultural ministries, but they were all part of a generalized policy, actually came, the centralization came with the election of the AKP, the Justice and Development Party government, for the first time in November 2002. And under the Erdogan government, Erdogan's party, the Justice and Development Party, in power since 2002, cultural heritage policy at home has become central to the active and purposeful reconfiguration of nationalism, according to an Ottoman neo-Millet model, or a neo-Ottoman model, as some people describe it, in a way that allows Turkey to exercise power at home, nationalist power over its minorities at home, but also soft power abroad. And it's interesting to note that in 2016, the Diyanet's budget actually quadrupled over a full decade to its current number of approximately $2 billion annually. And the Diyanet's mission has now been expanded beyond the domestic space to include the promotion of Turkish Islam abroad. Now, what has this meant in concrete terms for the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community of Turkey? It's meant that cultural heritage policy, understood as part of this broader nationalism project, has been deployed as a kind of homogenizing tool. It's been deployed as a weapon used in conditions absent active violence, but also in episodic violence, in ways that have put the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community at risk. And most specifically, we can see how cultural heritage policy used by these multiple state institutions has become a tool of expropriation, appropriation, in some cases destruction, of commercialization, and overall as a tool of erasure. Whether used in isolation or in tandem with other policy tools, for example, property rights, real estate and zoning law, election to foundation boards, educational, religious, and other forms of education, to erase the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community of Turkey. And let me give a specific example. And I would say that arguably the clearest example or illustration of this cultural heritage policy on Turkey's religious minority communities writ large, but with the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Greek Orthodox community most specifically, is what I've called the Hagia Sophia fetish of the country's current leadership. And what do I mean here? Well, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, or the Vakiflar, has been the tip of the spear in a program of religious erasure and replacement centering on the many Greek Orthodox churches named Hagia Sophia in Turkey. And all of these have been integral to the 2-millennium history of Christianity. So again, this policy targeted at the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Greek Orthodox community has implications for all Christian communities, indigenous Christian communities in Turkey, and by extension for the country's additional ethnic and religious minorities. And let me give you some specific examples. The district of Bursa's Vakiflar completed a 5-year restoration project of the Iznik Orhan Mosque of Hagia Sophia, that is, the Byzantine Church of Hagia Sophia, where the first and seventh ecumenical councils of Christianity occurred. And in this case, priceless Christian frescoes were covered, and then the restored church turned mosque eventually was opened with an Islamic prayer service on the first day of Ramadan in 2012. The next year, in 2013, the Vakiflar relaunched the Byzantine Orthodox Church of Hagia Sophia in the Black Sea city of Trebizonda, as a functioning mosque under what was called a restoration project. And that restoration project eliminated notable portions of the original church complex's green spaces and walking paths. Similarly, the Adrianople or Edirne Cultural Assets Protection Regional Board continued or undertook a city's reconstruction project for the Hagia Sophia Mosque in that city, And again, originally this was a Byzantine era Orthodox church, and it converted the church, the Edirne Church of Hagia Sophia, into an operational mosque. And this reverted one of the most historic Christian sites in the small geographic space of European Turkey into what Turkish state official described as, they called it reverted it to its foundational character of the site. So this Hagia Sophia fetish culminated or reached its apogee with the 2020 reversion of the Cathedral of the Hagia Sophia, a World Heritage Site under the 1972 UNESCO Convention, to a mosque. And that mosque has been named the Fatih Mosque, or the Conquest Mosque. And this motif of conquest, and therefore of erasure of the Orthodox Christian and Greek character of the Hagia Sophia, that motif of conquest as part of the Islamist and Turkish nationalism project was reiterated and expressed by the Diyanet's head Imam Ali Erbash when he ascended the minbar holding a sword in hand, as signifying that a mosque is a space not only for the connection between believers and God, but between Muslim believers and the Turkish state's political authority. So the Hagia Sophia reversion in 2022 was simply the latest and most mediatized expression of what I've called the Hagia Sophia fetish, whereby cultural heritage policy has been used as part of the nationalism project in order to expropriate, appropriate, and ultimately erase the Greek Orthodox Christian character of these religious spaces. And it's interesting to point out that in terms of cultural heritage policy, the same thing that has happened with the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul has also happened now to the Hora Church in Istanbul as well. And interestingly enough, the announcement about the intention of the decision to change the Hora Church from its status as a museum into an active mosque was made in November of 2019, before the Hagia Sophia decision, but the implementation of the policy came after the Hagia Sophia decision and implementation, specifically in May 2023. And for anyone who has visited either the Hagia Sophia or the Hora Church, you will have noticed changes to the physicality of those sites, limitations on access to spaces in the site, and in this regard, overt religious discrimination. For example, in the Hora Church, access to the nave of Hora, now a mosque, is limited to Muslims. So non-Muslims are not allowed to enter into the nave space. And all of this then involves a turning, a kind of expropriation of the historic patrimony of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community of Turkey, an expropriation of that and a turning over of ownership of those sites from the community themselves to the Turkish state. The close of the Halki school also figures into this pattern as well. And I want to just say a brief word here about cultural heritage management by the Ministry of Tourism, because I think this also figures into the weaponization of cultural heritage management in a way that, again, erases, either appropriates or expropriates, but ultimately erases the Greek Orthodox community and the memory and the active living heritage of the Greek Orthodox community and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And here I refer to the Ministry of Tourism's quote-unquote conservation and protection measures that have been applied to ancient Orthodox Christian monastic sites built into the Cappadocian rocks of Turkey's central Anatolian plateau. These cave dwellings constituted some of early Christianity's most formative monastic communities. So these are actually monasteries that are built into the Cappadocian rocks. And they include unrivaled examples of post-iconoclastic Byzantine art. The Turkish Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Tourism in particular has deprived, of course, the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community of Turkey from the active use of these monastic sites for religious purposes, and instead they have been commercialized. The remarkable cave complexes are now being commercialized and converted into luxury hotels with hot air balloon approaches. So this gives us a sense of the different Turkish ministries, the Vakıflar, the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Tourism, the way that they have used a heritage policy to deprive communities, the original communities, of ownership, of use of those sites, of the tangible sites, and therefore of all of the intangible practices, whether it's chanting, whether it's iconography, whether it's any other forms of the transmission, oral transmission of the original religious character of those sites, and therefore erase the memory of those communities in terms of their connection to the sites and the living intangible practices that go on with those sites. Now, time is short, so I can't go into further detail, but it does bear mention that this same cultural heritage policy that's been weaponized against the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Greek Orthodox community has also been used vis-a-vis the Armenian and Syriac Christian communities, as well as towards the Jewish community of Turkey. And here I want to offer one very just brief mention of that I think is illustrative of the weaponization of intangible, of cultural heritage policy vis-a-vis the intangible heritage of the Jewish community of Turkey. And I want to mention here the language policy that has been used as part of cultural heritage. Social science research has shown how the 1930s campaign called Citizens Speak Turkish, which promoted the nationalistic idea to speak Turkish at every public education occasion in the early years of the Turkish Republic, was actually adopted by the Jewish communities of Turkey as a mechanism for avoiding questions about their loyalty, but with consequences of the loss of this intangible form of cultural heritage. In other words, of language, and therefore of the capacity for the intergenerational transmission of identity and religion in terms of the Ladino language. I think it's very interesting that Sephardic Jews in Turkey were told to assimilate, but today's generation, what's left of that community in Turkey, is reclaiming its identity through the Ladino language, and therefore pushing back against cultural heritage policy that, in particular with regard to language and intangible heritage, was designed to erase that community. Now, finally, one quick note about the export of this same cultural heritage policy as a weapon of destruction and erasure. And here I reference the case of Cyprus. This summer, July and August, marked the 50th anniversary of Turkey's ongoing occupation of northern Cyprus. A snapshot of the cultural heritage reality in Turkish-occupied Cyprus, I think, is quite sobering. I've written about this, but there's extensive documentation by the Republic of Cyprus authorities, by officials from the Church of Cyprus and other Christian communities, Armenian, Maronite, Latin, as well as by the Jewish community, of the erasure and destruction of the tangible and the intangible heritage that goes along with sites in Turkish-occupied Cyprus. And some of the most extensive documentation of that destruction of heritage has been, and its geopolitical project and nationalism project is provided in Michael Jansen's 2005 and 2012 works, War and Cultural Heritage, Cyprus after the 1974 Turkish invasion, and then the loss of a civilization, destruction of cultural heritage in occupied Cyprus. Now, what we see in terms of the same sort of cultural heritage policy exported to Turkish occupied Cyprus is, again, either active destruction, the appropriation and trafficking of cultural heritage in a kind of memoricide, or the everyday killing of memory, the erasure of the people and the destruction and or trafficking of the sites involves, in terms of the Turkish occupation regime, a methodical and institutional obliteration of everything that is sacred to the non-Turkish Cypriot and non-Turkish settler population in occupied Cyprus. And one of the most paradigmatic illustrations of this deployment, export and deployment of cultural heritage policy, has been with regard to the 11th and 12th century church of Agios Synesios, which is the focal point, that church of the small, what's left of the small Greek Cypriot community that has remained in the town of Rizokarapaso in Turkish occupied Cyprus. Now, what was the all Greek Cypriot village of Rizokarapaso before 1974 involves now a little bit less than fewer than 250 Greek Orthodox Cypriots, as well as now Turks and Kurds who have been migrated from the mainland of Turkey since 1974. Why focus on Agios Synesios? Because again, I think it's so emblematic of the deployment of a cultural heritage policy that fits into a homogenizing nationalism project, a project of nationalism as conquest, and as a project that is a reminder of power relations that involve the destruction or the appropriation or the management, at the very least, of tangible and intangible heritage. Let me say just 2 words about the Church of Agios Synesios, and then I'll go to a very brief conclusion. The front entrance to that church in the post-1974 architected town center looks directly across at a flag of the Republic of Turkey, a very large flag of the Republic of Turkey, next to which is a huge bronze statue of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, seated atop a horse that is raised on its back legs. So the entrance to the church faces this enormous statue of Kemal atop a horse. The semiotics of size and positioning reflect this historical continuity and export between the Ataturkist experience and the drawing on the Ottoman experience when Sultan Mehmet II entered the Church of Hagia Sophia, the great Byzantine Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, on horseback. The other piece of this, again, the continuity between putatively secular Kemalist nationalism and religious nationalism, Erdoganist nationalism, with regard to Hagia Sophia, with regard to Agios Synesios, involves the fact that the hill behind the Church of Agios Synesios, on that hill sits a huge mosque built under the Erdogan government in Turkey. And the mosque, the colossal size of the mosque, the positioning over the smaller, much smaller Church of Agios Synesios, again, reminds us of Turkey's top Imam Ali Erbash inaugurating the reversion of the Hagia Sophia to a mosque as an event of reconquest. So we see here in the case of Cyprus, and there are other examples, the exporting of a cultural heritage model that is part of a nationalist project with continuities between the secularist and Islamist, or Ataturkist and Erdoganist forms of nationalism that have very similar elements And we also see the way in which heritage management involves either the erasure of or the denigration of, the diminution of the Greek Orthodox community of Turkey, what is left of the Greek Cypriot community in Turkish-occupied Cyprus, and that extends to other religious and ethnic minorities inside Turkey and in Turkish-occupied Cyprus. And just by way of some concluding comments, what might be done? By way of conclusion, if we understand the dynamics of how cultural heritage policy works and the implications for human rights violations or protections, what might be done by way of remedies? Is it possible to convert a policy that's been used as a cudgel into something that might be revised so that Turkey showcases its rich, pluralist, heterogeneous religious and cultural heritage? Is it possible, in other words, to move from a domination and trauma model to an inclusion and hope model? And here I would make 5 very brief points that are worth considering. Renegotiation of the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Turkey for the protection of cultural property in Turkey should follow the statutory requirements of the US's Cultural Property Implementation Act, which means that the Greek, Armenian, Assyrian, or Syriac and Jewish minorities are included in the renegotiation of that agreement, which will come due in 2025. It's a 5-year agreement that comes up for renegotiation and renewal. Secondly, with regard to Cyprus, I think it's important to encourage the UN Development Program, UNDP, and the EU to increase their funding to Cyprus Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage in ways that can be deployed to preserve the rich cultural heritage of the island before there is more destruction and trafficking. Also, it's important to encourage the integration of cultural heritage management on Cyprus into the religion track of the Cyprus peace process. That's my 3rd point. My 4th point, again with regard to Cyprus, is that the Heritage Youth Ambassadors Initiative be expanded to develop leadership skills and intergenerational training on cultural heritage preservation and protection through practices that amplify the linkages between tangible and intangible heritage and that develop respect for all of Cyprus's communities' heritage. And then finally, my 5th point would be to hold accountable and not reward violations by Turkey that involve the use of cultural heritage policy in ways that violate the human rights, including the religious freedom rights of Turkey's Greek Orthodox community and other religious minority communities. And here I would say that the US Commission on International Religious Freedom and the State Department should think seriously about the designation of CPC, country of particular concern, vis-a-vis Turkey, for the use of cultural heritage policy in times absent active violence, not in ways that have violated the human rights of Turkish citizens. And here I would suggest tools that might include the freezing of assets and the depriving of visas to travel to the US for those government institutions, the Diyanet, the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Tourism, those leaders who are responsible for violations of international law, and then certainly not to provide new weapons to a country that has used them against its own citizens and in occupation in Cyprus in ways that violate international law broadly, but also that violate cultural heritage protections in international legal instruments. And I'll leave it there, and we can talk about any of this in detail through your questions and or in discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prodromou, for this very excellent lecture. And now we will proceed to the questions. I'm going to read the questions, and if there are people that have more than one question, I will take first those that they have one question, and then I will go to those that they have second or third, and so on and so on. So the first question here is from Costa. I suppose this is Costa Dalayorgas. Says, thank you for this very informative lecture, Professor Prodromou. Do you foresee any hopeful developments in regards to Greek, Hellenic, and Orthodox cultural heritage in a post-Erdogan Turkish government, or will these ethno-nationalist policies continue regardless of which party controls the Turkish government?
I admit that I'm not especially optimistic in a post Erdogan Turkey, whenever that may be. My lack of optimism comes from the fact that there have been, as I tried to point out, important elements of continuity between the Kemalist governments. Turkish history and Turkish governments are usually kind of periodized into these, two categories of Kemalist and Erdoganist. And unfortunately, the worst features of cultural heritage policy deployed under the Erdogan governments were developed under the Kemalist governments. And so the continuity in terms of heritage policy being seen as a kind of nationalist project is what drives my pessimism or lack of optimism, let me put it that way. On the other hand, I think that there's a recognition in terms of even some non-AKP members, non-Erdogan supporters in the AKP government, and then also in terms of the opposition in Turkey, that the Turkey's brand has been extremely tarnished in the international system by the Hagia Sophia event, and also by the conversion or reversion of the Hora Church. And in that regard, I think there is some recognition in the political party space, but perhaps most importantly, in the professional and intellectual spaces that are concerned with heritage and democratization in Turkey, the linkage between heritage, human rights, and democratization in Turkey, that a change in policy, a shift towards an inclusivist model, and one that tries to amplify the richness of Turkey's heritage. There I have, some very, very cautious optimism. But I think that any post-Erdogan, initial post-Erdogan period in Turkey will be likely a period of some instability, so that there won't in the very near term be any meaningful change in heritage policy. And there I think it's incumbent upon those both inside Turkey and in the international community who have access to international institutions where Turkey can be accountable with regard to its heritage policy, to be as active as possible.
See a second question that's typically unusual. Let me ask a question to give the opportunity to others to type their questions if they have one or more. How much influence the international organizations like UNESCO or leverage they have on Turkey in order to reverse its policies? How real leverage do they have, these organizations?
I think that's a really important question. The UNESCO is constrained by, I think, a more general constraint when it comes to the protection of cultural heritage. And that's simply that there are no compliance and enforcement mechanisms that UNESCO has. This gets to your point about leverage. I mean, UNESCO has, in the aftermath of the reversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque, in the aftermath of the same thing with the Hora Church, the UNESCO leadership has expressed its concern and consternation and dissatisfaction. It has been critical of what Turkey has done. At the same time, it has actually, in the case of the Hagia Sophia reversion in particular. It has made 2 visits. Members of UNESCO's leadership have made 2 visits to Turkey to investigate the site and to meet with members of the Turkish state about the management of the site now as a mosque. They have issued 2 quite detailed reports on that detail grave concerns about changes to the physicality of the site and also to the sheer volume of visitors to the site and the consequent threats to the physical integrity of the site. Having said that, these are reports and these are declarations. There is no real enforcement mechanism. And I'm afraid the other thing that undermines UNESCO's leverage, if not its legitimacy, is the fact that Turkey continues to have a very significant place in the executive decision-making structure of UNESCO. So that even after the reversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque, Turkey was elected again to and here I would have to go back and look at the tenure, but a multi-year position on the executive committee of UNESCO. And there we see the impact of politics and financial contributions from members of UNESCO and the consequences then for leadership. So I guess that's a long way of saying that UNESCO has very little leverage because it doesn't have compliance and enforcement mechanisms at its disposal, and also because UNESCO depends on the contributions of its of the members, those who contribute actively to the budget of UNESCO. That means that financial leverage equals political leverage, and therefore undermines, I think, UNESCO's capacity to change the direction of Turkey's cultural heritage policy. Turkey's in violation of its UNESCO obligations. Any signatory to the UNESCO conventions on heritage are required, before they make any changes to universal heritage sites, to submit in writing the proposed changes to those sites. And Turkey did not follow that procedure, either with Hagia Sophia or the Hora Church. Now, the Turkish government may claim that by virtue of making public its intentions to change or to revert both of those museums to active mosque status, that they met that requirement, but indeed they did not, because they would have been required to submit in writing to UNESCO that in these 2 particular cases, because they are World Heritage Sites, they should have submitted in writing their intentions to change the nature of those sites, and they did not do it.
So for Turkey to be able to get an upper hand in these committees there, this means that it has lots of political influence in the international community. I mean, there are many states, they are probably Islamic states or something of that nature, that they support Turkey, because I suppose these positions, as you mentioned, the executive position, etc., they are decided by vote of members of the international community. Is that correct?
Well, and these international institutions depend on their capacity to do the work, also depend on their budget. So members who or signatories who are non-contributors, or whoever contributes more effectively has a competitive advantage or a comparative advantage in terms of their influence in the institutions. And I think, in the case of support for Turkey by, I guess, Muslim majority states, if that's, what you're saying, I think that's a really mixed bag since the election of Erdogan. And that has as much to do with the geopolitics of leadership competition within what some people would call the Muslim world as it does for anything else. And in particular, I would say in the most recently, Erdogan's very active efforts to and declared statements to position Turkey as the so-called leader of the Muslim world have been met not with a great deal of enthusiasm by other members, for example, of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, such as Saudi Arabia or Iran, which see themselves as leaders of the Muslim world, even the UAE. And the UAE is an interesting case as well when it comes to heritage management and thinking about heritage as part of countries' geopolitical objectives. The UAE, for example, has supported and developed something called the Abraham, I have to remember the exact tool, the Abraham House or houses, which is basically a complex of church, mosque, and synagogue in the UAE as part of the as part of the Abraham Accords, whereby the UAE has begun to position itself in the greater Middle East as a Muslim majority country that respects and allows for the tangible and intangible heritage protection of its multiple faith communities, in this case, the three Abrahamic communities of Christianity, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we see some differentiation there. And I think that's interesting. And I think in the case of the UAE, that orientation has come with a recognition that respect for cultural heritage, or at least lack of a cultural heritage policy that's not overtly designed for homogenization, but that recognizes pluralism, is something that is a soft power advantage for, in this case, the UAE in the international community.
Something to this, and then I'll go to the next question. But who decides that these positions, they can be bought? Because this undermines the credibility of the national organizations like UNESCO.
You know what? I can't give you a precise answer when it comes to how UNESCO's administrative structure and positions of leadership function. But I do know for a fact that after the reversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque, Turkey ended up with a reappointment to the executive committee of UNESCO. I would say, though, even beyond that, I think there's something else at work here too. And this goes back to where I started. Number one, a recognition by international institutions and also by those states that claim to speak for and be standard bearers of a rules-based international order. There's the need to recognize that cultural heritage policy and human respect for universal human rights are intrinsically linked, number one. And I think there has been a belated recognition of that. And number two, there's the need to then hold violators accountable. And if, in particular, the transatlantic space and the United States and its EU partners are going to stand for something called a rules-based international order, then it's incumbent upon them to use the mechanisms at their disposal or the fora in which they participate to hold violators accountable. And that's why I mentioned that, in the closing sort of set of bullet points about what might be done to incentivize, but also then to penalize a country like Turkey. I think, for example, the kinds of recommendations that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom might make if it designates Turkey either a watch list or, I think more accurately, it should be a country of particular concern. Those members of the Diyanet, the Turkish Ministry of Religious Affairs, or the Ministry of Culture, or the Ministry of Tourism, those leaders who are responsible for violations of cultural heritage safeguards should not be rewarded, for example, with visas to come to the United States to travel. They should have their assets frozen. They should pay a price, and there are very targeted tools that can be used until they change those behaviors. And there's precedent for doing that. I mean, there are cases where leaders of countries who have been designated either as watch list countries or countries of particular concern have not been given visas to travel to the United States because of their violations of human rights. And so I think there are some this is the low-hanging fruit. These are, small tools that have a, relatively big impact, a comparatively big impact to get countries to change their behavior, or those individuals and governments, those institutions and governments that are responsible for these violations to change their behavior. But that requires political will in an agency like the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and more specifically in the case of Turkey in the State Department.
Thank you. The next question is from Sava Kokoglu. Do Turkey's claims that Greece is doing something similar to its Muslim minority have any basis?
I think that the Greek state has, the Greek government, the Greek state has dramatically improved the way it understands the protection of mosques and other associated Islamic sites as part of their responsibilities to respect the human rights of all of its citizens. Turkey reduces the way that it engages with what's left of its Greek Orthodox minority in the Ecumenical Patriarchate to a question of reciprocity with the Muslim minority, and in particular the Turkish Muslim minority in Greece. And I think, first of all, we're talking about, first of all, the principle of reciprocity should not apply. States are responsible for respecting the rights of their citizens, regardless of what their neighbors or others may do. Secondly, we're talking about apples and oranges here, to put it in the vernacular in terms of numbers. And thirdly, those areas where the Greek state has been subjected to criticism, and it's been taken also to the European Court of Human Rights and to other international fora, the Greek state has complied with the findings. So that's a way of saying that where there have been violations, the Greek state has implemented the remedies that have been recommended by those. Again, there aren't compliance mechanisms, but that have been recommended by those international fora. And again, I think the important point here is 2 points. One, to recognize that Greece, like any other state, must comply by its international obligations, legal obligations around human rights and heritage. And number two, that given the scope and the consequences of Turkey's heritage policy, which has been very clearly designed as a means to eradicate any memory and any active presence of its minority, Greek Orthodox minority. The scope of that makes Greek violations pale in comparison. And again, that's in no way to say that the Greek state should not meet its own obligations. But this is a kind of canard that is used by Turkey to avoid addressing, again, the scale and the scope and the impact of its own heritage policies and the associated violations of human rights that are part of that.
Next question is from Costa again. Can you talk more about Turkey's recent actions towards Greek Hellenic heritage in occupied northern Cyprus? Also, what is the US and the State Department doing to push back against Turkey's actions in occupied Cyprus?
Well, I think the recent actions, I think it's more, I think it's helpful for us to just see a half century of uninterrupted policy. And I think in the case of occupied Cyprus, a couple of things are really important. Number one, for us to recognize, what's happened in Turkish occupied Cyprus is indeed the export of Turkey's cultural heritage policy. And so Turkish occupied Cyprus becomes important not only on its own merits, but also because of the way in which Turkey has used this kind of policy outside of its own borders, without paying any price for that. And so we begin to see it creeping into other parts of the world in which Turkey has direct and indirect influence. And here I refer in particular to Turkey's support for Azerbaijan's policy of ethnic and religious cleansing of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. So going back specifically to Cyprus, first of all, the wholesale destruction. What has Turkey done? Wholesale destruction of cultural heritage in the form of destruction of churches, monasteries, chapels, etc. That's been one of the main tools. So destruction. Number two, that has gone along with the cleansing and or expulsion of the Greek Orthodox and other minority communities from Turkey, which has been consequential because it has meant that not only has the tangible cultural heritage been destroyed, but all of the intangible practices and the local economies and ecosystems that can transmit memory over time have been eliminated. No sites, no people, no memory, to put it simply. The other thing which Turkey has done as well it has participated in the trafficking of tangible heritage. And there, in terms of what the U.S. has done, the U.S. has more actively participated with the international community in trying to prevent the trafficking. And I'm looking here, I would like to get a number for you, prevent and returning any artifacts which are trafficked artifacts and discovered. And I have here, I want to read this number. The director of the Office for Combating Illegal Possession and Trafficking of Antiquities of the Cyprus Police estimates that over 16,000 artifacts, including mosaics, murals, and icons, have been looted and trafficked internationally since Turkey's invasion in 1974. And here the United States has returned artifacts that it has found, as has Germany, as has Japan. So the United States is participating actively in international policing and anti-trafficking efforts to return looted artifacts to Turkey. But I think the real question is, has the U.S. exerted any influence on Turkey to stop that kind of trafficking, looting and trafficking? And I think the answer is simply no. As we know, in most cases where Turkey violates international human rights, including cultural heritage safeguards, the standard response of the United States, regardless of Republican or Democratic administrations, has been and continues to be that Turkey is a strategic partner of such importance that that geostrategic priorities trump these kinds of cultural heritage and human rights violations. And I think the United States has been very slow to recognize and come to terms with the fact that those kinds of violations undermine both the legitimacy of the transatlantic alliance to stand for a rules-based international order, and also signal the fact that over time, the corrosive impact of those behaviors has meant that the U.S. doesn't exert much leverage either bilaterally or multilaterally on a country that is meant to share the same values and therefore commit to the same interests. I don't know if that may change. Now we just had another election. There's a new administration incoming, but I'm not very optimistic.
Thank you. I don't see another question now. Oh, there is another one. Okay. This comes from Nikki Chichis. how influential is the Catholic Church within that organization, and how it comes that it has mostly remained moderately vocal? Why has it not condemned repeatedly and with greater strength? And thanks for your great presentation.
Well, thank you for your kind words about the presentation. If I understand the question correctly, the viewer is asking, why has the Vatican not been more vocal and active in either publicly condemning Turkey and or
Yes.
yeah, and or using its own suasion? I think that well, a few things. Number one, there have been several incidents under this government in Turkey, under the Erdogan government in Turkey, where Roman Catholic bishops have actually been killed. They've been targeted and killed by citizens who claim to be supporters of the AKP government. Those who have perpetrated the attacks, when they've been brought to justice, have not been convicted, or they've been given light convictions. And in most cases, the attacks have been justified as the actions of people who are suffering from severe mental illness. Now, what does that mean in terms of the Vatican? The Vatican's expectations have been that the perpetrators would be brought to justice. I think that the Vatican has chosen to engage as in a way that they would see as constructive as possible in order to avoid rendering their bishops even more vulnerable and their community more vulnerable, recognizing, I think, that yes, the Vatican voice would be important, but it would be impossible to redirect policy with only one voice. The other thing that has been interesting, a recent development that the Vatican has, in terms of Vatican policy, let me put it this way, is the much announced, much kind of mediatized opening of a Syriac church in Turkey. And the Turkish state last year, the Turkish state argued that this was the first new Syriac church built in Turkey since the establishment of the Republic. Where does the Vatican figure into that? In fact, the church was built after a very protracted process whereby the Syriac community submitted its request to the Turkish government. The church was eventually allowed to be built on what was Roman Catholic property. And so why do I mention this? Because the Vatican, I think, recognized that, the roadblocks, the ongoing roadblocks to the building of this new church would probably be never ending. And so I see the willingness, I interpreted the willingness of the Roman Catholic Church to lend the Vatican to basically lend that property, offer that property to the Syriac community as a mechanism that allowed for the greater Christian community, the ecumenical Christian community in Turkey, to sustain itself in the face of the impediments by the Turkish state. So to sum up, I would say that the Vatican seems to have chosen more of an indirect, quiet diplomacy engagement with Turkey to make small advances, recognizing that a major shift in policy is likely not going to happen absent a more muscular approach, or at least a unified approach by some of Turkey's Western allies.
Okay, now there is another question, which is about half a page long.
Okay.
I would encourage the people who they ask questions to put their name down. So although the attendee remains anonymous, I will try to quickly present some features of this question.
Okay.
why does the Patriarchate stay in Istanbul? Since Turkey's anti-Greek pogrom of 1955, Turkey's Greek population has been reduced to perhaps 2,000, mainly elderly people. And again, St. Sophia functions as a mosque, influenced by Clinton, Pompeo, Jeffrey Payet, and assorted neoconservatives. The Bishop of Istanbul is in essence a Western intelligence operative and something of this nature all the way down.
What was that last part? The Bishop of Istanbul?
Yeah,
It's,
he talks about the patriarch, I suppose.
no, I understand, but is a what? Is an operative? What was that?
Yeah, is in essence a Western intelligence operative and the deputy of the Turkish state. And then this, of course, the next thing is true, as I understand, when Turkish President Erdogan sent troops to Syria to the detriment of Syria's Christians and other minorities, Bartholomew sent a supportive letter to Erdogan. Bartholomew also conferred the cross of St. Andrew to Andriy Parubi, a Western Ukrainian Catholic who is a co-founder of the Ukraine's fascist nationalist party.
Okay, so
I think what I said is true. Is I had read too that Bartholomew sent something to the nature of bless the arms of Turkey when they had an incursion in Syria.
okay, so there's a lot in that question. One thing that I find interesting about the question is the statement that the Ecumenical Patriarchate is an intelligence post of the United States, basically. That is sounds very much like the narrative out of the Moscow Patriarchate. In fact, that is the official narrative of the Moscow Patriarchate since the issuing of the Tomos of Autocephaly for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. If anyone reads the various digital platforms of the Moscow Patriarchate, their argument, this is exactly their argument, that the Tomos of Autocephaly was not a consequence of the rights of the Synod of Constantinople to grant that Tomos, but that instead it was something engineered in Washington. So it's clear that Moscow Patriarchate narrative, and we know it's out there on many digital platforms, and for some it's been consumed and accepted. I would reject that, but that's a whole other conversation. So, but I do think it's important. That's a kind of interesting formulation of the viewer's question. Regarding the other pieces of the question, the statement by not only the letter, not only signed by the Ecumenical Patriarch, but by the heads of all of the religious communities in Turkey, the minority religious communities in Turkey, supporting Turkey's so-called peace operation in northern Syria. Another example of Turkey, by the way, violating the territorial integrity of its neighbors and targeting and cleansing the religious minorities in particular, but the ethnic minorities as well in northern Syria, as they have done in occupied Cyprus. So why the letter? I think it's important for anyone who works on human rights issues, but more generally for the way we can make sense of things that seem to be nonsensible and or irrational. It's important to recognize that the communities in Turkey, the minority communities in Turkey, live in a state of chronic, constant, and direct danger. And so those communities oftentimes are forced, some could argue they don't have to do it, but human rights activists would use this language, are forced into what are called kind of performative exercises. And so the choice is either sign, and therefore in a public performance, a letter becomes a public performance, which of course in this case was mediatized, a public performance of loyalty. They're forced to exercise, participate in these loyalty performances in the face of a state that can easily take punitive action, either in the form of violence or other less visible forms of retribution against the members of those communities. So I think that's definitely what we saw in the form of that letter. Another example of that, when Erdogan this year, when Erdogan, or last year, what year are we in, 2024, last year with the re-election of the AKP government, the ecumenical patriarch, the bishop of the Roman Catholic Bishop of Istanbul, and all of the other, the Grand Rabbi of Istanbul, the leaders of all of the religious minority communities were invited to the inauguration in Ankara. They attended. The choice is go and then again be instrumentalized through the presentation of them in the media, where the Turkish state says, see, all of our minority communities are here, they all support the government, or don't go and put your community members at risk. And in the case of the ecumenical patriarchate in the Greek Orthodox community, that means putting, about 17 to 1800 skewed towards the elderly community members at risk. So again, these communities are, their leaders are placed in a position whereby they're engaged in what are considered performative, almost spectacles. And there's, if you read somebody called Ecum, he writes a lot about this, the performative spectacle aspect. So I think what I'm saying is we need to actually think about the facts on the ground and how it is that hostage populations that are vulnerable to an authoritarian punitive state that will take action and the international community will do nothing about it, how they have to calculate these kinds of decisions and actions as a way to protect the members of their community. So that's what I would say about those things. Regarding the other piece about why the patriarch remains in Istanbul, because that's its historic site. I understand the logic of, or I understand, yes, the logic of the question. Well, perhaps if the Patriarchate were to move outside of Istanbul, the members of the Patriarchate, including the Patriarch, could act with greater freedom. That's certainly the case, but greater freedom to do what? If the idea of being more free is to actually be able to support the survival and the sustainability of a living community, and or to ensure the protections of the sites and the tangible cultural heritage of that community. I'm not convinced, I haven't heard a persuasive argument that being outside would advance that objective more than staying there. And I guess I would ask, would we ever expect, for example, given the instability in the Holy Land in Israel and the Palestinian territories, would we ever expect, or ask, for the Jews to relocate the Wailing Wall outside of Israel, where, it may be endangered because of, an attack from Israel's enemies? These are not questions, I think, that we ask in other cases. And again, I think we're most specifically where the Patriarchate is concerned, I have not ever heard a persuasive argument made that removing the Patriarchate, relocating the Patriarchate from its historic site of Constantinople, where it has been there for millennia, to I don't know where, New York, Geneva, Washington, would ultimately advance the cause of sustaining living Greek Orthodox Christians inside of Turkey. I think the message would simply be a century of violent and non-violent oppression, repression, and cultural heritage policy designed to eliminate that community has succeeded, because, okay, there's now a patriarchate outside of Turkey, but there are no living Christians left inside Turkey. And it would set a horrible precedent for other faith communities living under authoritarian governments who deploy similar sets of policies that, if you just have at it long enough, you can get these people to leave. If you don't eliminate them, all of them, or you don't destroy their heritage, their tangible and intangible heritage. If you just work long enough, then they're going to leave. And I think that's a horrible message and a terrible precedent that would support homogenization rather than encouraging pluralization and rule of law and equality before the state in countries that, you know, support diversity.
I think that's what the Turkey actually wants to, is just to push them out.
Yeah,
So
and
it will
again,
take-
it would set a terrible precedent for
Yeah.
other vulnerable communities who are, you know, facing repression and oppression by states that are committed to their elimination.
Yeah, well, I think it's getting late, so I don't see any other questions, although we could talk for a very long time. Myself, I would have lots of questions to put and sustain this discussion. So I would like to thank you very, very much for this very excellent question. And I'm sorry that you got ill and did not have the opportunity to have a lecture here in Chicago. We will have a better attendance, and I think it will be more enjoyable. But then we will look to the future.
I
Well,
look forward to
Yeah.
future opportunities. And again, I really regret having taken ill. But if you teach in the university environment where the
Yeah.
university is basically one big petri dish, everybody is sick with the flu and ear and sinus infections all the time. This is part of the, you know, it's part
Sure.
of the risks of the space.
Professional risk, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. So I close the lecture, and please stay for a few minutes after the closing.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for all of those who ask questions. I appreciate your attention.